If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
Have you ever wondered how deep the rot goes? How many lives are destroyed while the people in power look the other way? Or worse, how many of them profit from it? Steve Johnson never set out to be a hero. At 52 years old, he was just a Border Patrol agent trying to do his job. A job that used to mean something. But over the years, he had seen the system fall apart. Cartels crossing the border like it was nothing. Drug lords living like kings while American families buried their children. Politicians giving speeches while taking cartel money behind closed doors. And no matter how many arrests he made, how many busts went down, nothing changed. But that Tuesday morning, that was the day everything changed. That was the day Steve stumbled onto something he was never meant to see. The sun was brutal, even at dawn. Steve sat behind the wheel of his Ford Raptor, sipping stale coffee, his eyes scanning the never-ending wasteland of sand and rock. Beside him, Rex sat in the passenger seat, his tongue lolling out, his golden-brown fur catching the light. A Belgian Malinois trained for tracking, detection, and combat. But more than that, his best damn friend. "Looks quiet today," Steve muttered, scratching Rex behind the ears. The dog huffed, his ears twitching. Steve was about to radio in his checkpoint clearance when Rex stiffened, his ears snapped up. His body went rigid, then came the low growl. Steve's instincts immediately flared to life. Something was out there. Steve killed the engine. Stepping out, he grabbed his M4 carbine, slinging it over his chest. Rex was already on alert, his nose working overtime. "Show me, buddy," Steve whispered. Rex took off, through the rocks, over the sand. Steve followed, his boots crunching against dry earth. Then he saw it. A heat shimmer rising from the base of a rock formation ahead. But it wasn't just the heat, it was the smell. A mix of chemicals, sweat, and something worse, something rotten. Steve's grip tightened on his rifle. This wasn't just another smuggler's stash, this was something bigger. And when Rex stopped in front of a hidden entrance, a narrow crevice leading underground, Steve's blood ran cold. This was a lab. Steve barely had time to radio it in. Gunfire exploded from the cliffs above. Bullets kicked up sand and rock, forcing him to dive behind cover. Cartel, at least 6 of them, dressed in black tactical gear, moving like professionals. Not just smugglers. Kill squads. They were guarding this place. And that meant one thing. Steve wasn't supposed to walk away from this. Rex lunged first. A gunman screamed as the dog sank his teeth into his arm, dragging him down. Steve popped up, M4 raised. 2 shots, center mass. The gunman collapsed. Steve spun, firing again. A second cartel enforcer dropped, blood spraying against the rocks. But there were too many of them. A burst of gunfire ripped through the air. Bullets slammed into Steve's cover. He ducked, heart pounding, sweat pouring down his neck. "Rex, back!" he yelled. The dog obeyed instantly, retreating to his side. Steve checked his ammo. Half a mag left. Not good. Then, the sound he didn't want to hear. A helicopter. Steve looked up, and his stomach dropped. A blacked-out helicopter was coming in fast, kicking up sand. More cartel reinforcements. He was trapped. The system had left him to die before. But this time, he wasn't going down without a fight. He grabbed his radio, hoping anyone was listening. "This is Agent Johnson. I'm in a firefight near Sector 9. Cartel reinforcements incoming. I need." The radio crackled. Then came the answer. Not from Border Patrol, not from DEA. A woman's voice. Sharp, cold, precise. "Hold your position, Agent Johnson. We're sending backup." "Who the hell is this?" Steve demanded. A pause. Then, "CIA." The bullets kept coming. Steve Johnson pressed himself against the rocks, his grip tightening on his rifle. Rex snarled beside him, ready to kill. Above them, the cartel's helicopter hovered like a vulture, dust and sand whipping through the air. The enforcers were closing in, and Steve had one burning question. Why the hell was the CIA involved? "Repeat, who the hell is this?" Steve growled into his radio. The woman's voice came again. "Backup is en route. Stay alive." Stay alive. Easy for her to say. Steve had been in gunfights before. But not like this. These cartel enforcers weren't running. They were trained, tactical, professional killers, and they weren't here to scare him off. They were here to wipe him from existence. One of the gunmen tried to flank left. Big mistake. Rex launched forward like a missile, teeth flashing. The man screamed as the dog clamped onto his throat, dragging him to the ground. Gunfire ripped the air. Steve turned, fired. One shot, right between the eyes. The cartel enforcer dropped, dead before he hit the ground. But the others were still coming, and Steve was running out of time. The helicopter roared overhead. Steve barely had time to react before, boom, an explosion rocked the desert. Grenade. The shockwave sent him sprawling, ears ringing. Sand pelted his face, his rifle flew from his hands. For a second, just a second, his vision went white. Then, a boot slammed into his ribs. Steve gasped, pain flaring in his chest. A cartel gunman stood over him, rifle aimed. This was it. Execution time. The barrel of the rifle leveled at his skull. And then, crack. A sniper round tore through the gunman's head. Blood splattered across the rocks. Steve blinked, trying to process what just happened. The radio crackled again. "I told you to stay alive, Johnson." The CIA was here. A black SUV tore across the desert, kicking up dust. Before Steve could even process it, a full strike team emerged. Not Border Patrol, not DEA, CIA paramilitary. They moved with precision, taking down the remaining cartel enforcers like they were training dummies. Within 60 seconds, the fight was over. Bodies lay scattered across the sand. The helicopter? Gone. And standing in the middle of the wreckage was her. She was tall, lean, and built like she had been carved from stone. Dark tactical gear, sharp eyes, a pistol resting easy on her hip. Lucia Ramirez, CIA special agent, a ghost in the intelligence world. And she was looking at Steve like he was already a dead man. "You're lucky we intercepted your call," she said. Steve spat blood into the sand. "Yeah, feels like I was handling it just fine." Lucia smirked. "Sure, if you call getting shot at by cartel enforcers, fine." Steve grabbed his rifle, standing slowly. Rex pressed against his side, still on high alert. "I don't trust the CIA," Steve said flatly. Lucia raised an eyebrow. "Good. I don't trust Border Patrol." Steve clenched his jaw. "I don't work for you," he growled. Lucia stepped closer. Too close. "No," she said, voice low. "But you just walked into something way bigger than a drug bust, and if you don't listen, Johnson, you're gonna end up in a ditch." She let that sink in before turning away. "Get in the truck," she said. "We need to talk." Steve hesitated. He had two options. One, go back to his station, file a report, and watch the government sweep this under the rug. Two, get in the truck. He looked down at Rex. The dog's eyes never left Lucia. Steve sighed. "Fine, but if I don't like what you're selling, I'm walking." Lucia smirked. "We'll see." Inside the SUV, Lucia pulled up a satellite image of the cave. Steve's stomach tightened. It wasn't just a fentanyl lab. It was part of something bigger. The satellite image zoomed out. More heat signatures, more underground facilities. All linked to the same cartel. The Noche Eterna cartel. Lucia's voice was deadly serious. "They aren't just making fentanyl, Johnson. They're testing it." Steve frowned. "On who?" Lucia's expression hardened. "On people." Steve's hands curled into fists. "We're talking mass production," Lucia continued. "A synthetic opioid so pure, so undetectable, it could kill millions before we even knew what hit us." Steve exhaled sharply. "So why isn't the government doing anything?" Lucia hesitated. Then she said it. The words that made Steve's blood run cold. "Because someone in the US government is protecting them." "What if I told you the war on drugs is a lie? What if I told you that the same people promising to fight it are the ones making the real money?" Steve Johnson had seen bad things before. But this was something else. The satellite images didn't lie. This wasn't just another cartel lab. It was an operation, a system, and it was protected. By people with power. By people who didn't want to be exposed. Lucia Ramirez knew more than she was saying. But Steve didn't care. Not anymore. Because if what she said was true, then this was bigger than the cartel. Bigger than the DEA. Bigger than anything he had ever faced, and it was time to burn it down. The SUV roared across the desert, kicking up sand. Lucia drove fast and quiet. Steve sat in the passenger seat, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the horizon. Rex was in the back, ears twitching. The dog could feel it too. Something bad was coming. The mine was 20 miles from the original lab. Cartel territory. No roads, no patrols, no backup. Just them. 2 agents, 1 dog, against a cartel army. Steve exhaled slowly. "Tell me one thing," he said. Lucia didn't take her eyes off the road. "What? Why the hell does the CIA care about a fentanyl lab?" A pause. Then Lucia said the words that made his stomach drop. "Because this isn't just fentanyl, Johnson. It's a biological weapon." Steve went still. Lucia kept talking. The cartel isn't just making a new opioid, they're making it undetectable. Something no scanner, no field test, no autopsy can trace. Something that can be used to kill millions before anyone even realizes what's happening. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw it. Fear. The test subjects? Steve asked. Lucia hesitated. Then, trafficked migrants, people no one will ever look for. Steve's grip tightened on his rifle. The government knows. Lucia nodded. They don't just know. They're protecting it. The mine loomed ahead, a gaping hole in the earth, surrounded by rusted machinery. Steve and Lucia approached on foot. Rex moved first, nose to the ground, body tense, no guards, no lights, too quiet. Steve's gut screamed a warning. Lucia pressed a hand to her earpiece. No radio signals. This place is off-grid. They moved forward, step by step, down the mine shaft. The air grew colder. The smell hit them like a hammer. Sweat, urine, blood. Then they saw it, the cages. There were dozens of them. Rusting iron cages lined up like livestock pens. Bodies pressed together, some barely breathing. Men, women, children. Some were conscious, some were not. Some would never wake up again. Steve's stomach turned. He had spent years on the border, arresting traffickers, stopping smugglers. But this was something else. This was systematic, organized, government protected. Lucia knelt beside one of the cages. A young girl, no older than 10, stared back at her with hollow eyes. Her arms were covered in needle marks. Steve felt his chest tighten. Lucia looked up. Her voice was flat, cold. We were too late. Lucia jerked back, blood splattering the dirt. Steve spun. A cartel enforcer stepped from the shadows, rifle raised. Steve dropped him with 2 shots. More gunfire. More cartel soldiers emerging from the darkness. They had walked into a trap. Steve grabbed Lucia, dragging her behind cover. Rex snarled and launched into the fight. Bullets tore through the mine. Steve fired back, heart pounding. They were outnumbered. They were pinned down. And then, the ground shook. A massive explosion ripped through the cave system. Lucia's eyes widened. They're collapsing the mine, Steve cursed. They had one way out, and they were running out of time. Steve fired blindly, covering their retreat. Rex took down another gunman, teeth ripping through flesh. Lucia stumbled, blood dripping from her shoulder. The walls groaned. The ceiling cracked. The entire mine was coming down. Steve grabbed the girl from the cage. He didn't know if she was dead or alive, but he wasn't leaving her here. Move, he shouted. Lucia ran. Steve ran. Rex stayed at their backs, snapping at the heels of anyone who followed. And then, the mine collapsed. The dust swallowed them whole. What happens when you know something the world isn't supposed to hear? What happens when the people in power decide you shouldn't be alive? The world was spinning. Steve wasn't sure if it was the concussion or the blood loss. He was buried alive. Somewhere in the wreckage of the collapsed mine, his ears rang, his head pounded, and his lungs burned from inhaling dust. Somewhere nearby, Rex whimpered. He was alive, barely. And Lucia? Steve tried to move. Pain tore through his ribs. Lucia, he croaked. No answer. For a moment, panic gripped his chest. Then, a weak cough. She was alive. But for how long? And more importantly, who else had survived? They didn't have to wonder for long, because before Steve could even sit up, the barrel of a rifle pressed against his skull. Rough hands grabbed him, yanking him out of the debris. Lucia was dragged beside him, her face pale from blood loss. Rex snarled weakly, trying to stand, but a cartel enforcer kicked him hard in the ribs. Steve saw red. His arms were wrenched behind his back. And then came the voice. Deep, calm, deadly. You should have stayed out of this, senor. Steve lifted his head. Standing before him, pristine white suit, dark sunglasses, untouched by the chaos, was Manuel Diaz, the underboss of the Noche Eterna cartel and the last man Steve wanted to see. They were thrown into the back of a truck. Steve's hands were zip-tied. Lucia was barely conscious, and Rex, the cartel had muzzled him, bound his legs. The anger in the dog's eyes was the same rage burning inside Steve. Diaz climbed into the truck, sitting across from them, perfectly calm. Let me explain how this works, Diaz said. His voice was almost polite. You answer my questions, you live, you lie, you suffer, simple no? Steve spat blood onto the floor. Diaz sighed, then he snapped his fingers. A cartel enforcer grabbed Lucia's arm. She barely had time to react before, crack, her pinky finger bent the wrong way. She didn't scream, but Steve saw the fire in her eyes. Diaz smiled. Ah, strong, I like that. He turned back to Steve. Now, let's talk about what you saw in that mine. Steve knew how this worked. Cartels didn't do long interrogations. They got what they needed. Then they got rid of you. And Steve? He was already dead, unless he made a move. Steve pretended to break. He started talking, feeding Diaz half-truths, buying time. Meanwhile, his fingers worked the zip ties. Lucia saw what he was doing. So did Rex. The moment was coming. Diaz leaned forward. Who else knows about the mine? Steve grinned. You're about to find out. And then, all hell broke loose. Steve snapped the zip ties. Lucia lunged, using her legs to knock a guard off balance. Rex tore through the muzzle, ripping into the nearest enforcer. Gunfire erupted. The truck swerved. Steve grabbed a pistol off a dead man, fired 3 shots. Diaz ducked, but not before a bullet grazed his arm. The truck hit something hard, and suddenly, everything flipped. Metal screamed. The world turned upside down. Steve felt weightlessness for half a second, then the truck slammed into the ground. The impact ripped the doors open. Lucia rolled free, gasping. Rex stumbled out, blood on his fur, but still standing. Steve coughed, trying to push himself up. Gunfire erupted from the cartel convoy behind them. They were not out of this yet. Steve grabbed Lucia. Can you run? She winced, gripping her shoulder. Like hell I can. Good, because they didn't have a choice. The cartel was regrouping. If they stayed here, they'd be executed in minutes. They had one shot, make it to the trees, disappear into the jungle, and somehow, live long enough to expose the truth. Steve tightened his grip on his gun. Lucia took a breath. Rex growled, baring his teeth, and then they ran. When the system betrays you, when the law protects the guilty, when the only justice left is the one you make with your own hands. What would you do? Steve Johnson was running out of time. The jungle was thick, humid, and unforgiving. Lucia was bleeding, Rex was limping, and the cartel wasn't stopping. Somewhere behind them, Manuel Diaz was still alive, still hunting them, and Steve knew one thing for sure. This war wasn't over, not by a long shot. The jungle was alive with sound, birds screeching, insects buzzing, and behind them, the low hum of cartel radios. Men moving through the underbrush, tracking them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Lucia was struggling to keep up. Steve kept his pace slow, but not too slow. If they stopped, they died. Lucia winced, gripping her shoulder. You still want to know the truth? She asked, her voice strained. Steve glanced at her. Now? Really? Lucia forced a weak smirk. Yeah, because if we die, someone should know. Steve kept moving, scanning ahead. Then talk. Lucia took a breath. The fentanyl lab? The mine? That wasn't just cartel work. Steve's jaw tightened. We already knew the government was covering for them. Lucia shook her head. It's bigger than that. She stumbled, but Steve caught her. She looked him dead in the eye. Johnson, this isn't just about drugs. She swallowed hard. It's about control. Lucia pushed forward. That fentanyl formula? It's not just about making money. It's designed to be unstoppable. Steve's stomach tightened. You mean? Lucia nodded. It's a bioweapon. Steve stopped walking. Lucia turned back. We need to keep moving. But Steve wasn't processing anything else, because suddenly, everything made sense. The government cover-up, the CIA's involvement, the cartel's confidence. This wasn't about trafficking. It was about power. About a weapon that could kill millions, undetected. And the people in charge wanted to make sure no one could stop it. Lucia grabbed his arm. Come on, Johnson. We don't have time. A gunshot rang out. Bark, Rex yelped, stumbling. Steve turned fast. Cartel enforcers emerged from the jungle, guns raised. Drop your weapons, one of them barked. Steve lifted his rifle. Crack! A bullet tore through his shoulder. He went down. Hard. Lucia lunged for her gun, but another shot sent her crashing to the ground. Pain, heat, blood. The last thing Steve saw before everything went black was Rex baring his teeth, refusing to back down. Darkness, pain, voices. Steve woke up tied to a chair, his head pounded, his shoulder burned. Lucia was slumped beside him, still unconscious, and standing in front of him, Manuel Diaz. The cartel underboss smiled. Welcome back, amigo. Steve stayed silent. Diaz paced slowly. You killed a lot of my men, Johnson, he tsked. Now, I could kill you for that. He leaned in, or we could make a deal. Steve glared. Diaz smirked. You think you know the truth? He chuckled. Then you should know. You're fighting the wrong people. He pulled out a folder, tossed it onto the table. Steve's eyes narrowed. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside, classified government documents, emails, bank transfers, orders, signed by high-ranking U.S. officials, and at the top of the list, a name Steve never expected. Lucia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw the file, her face drained of color. Steve clenched his jaw, because written on those documents was Lucia's name. What do you do when the one person you trusted is part of the lie? When the war isn't just against the cartel, but against the people pulling the strings from the shadows? Steve Johnson had seen corruption before. He had seen DEA agents take bribes. He had seen politicians turn a blind eye. He had seen cartel money flow through the hands of people meant to stop them. But this was something else. This was Lucia Ramirez's name, on a classified government file. A file proving that she wasn't just chasing the cartel, she was part of the cover-up. Steve stared at the documents. Lucia's name, her signature, her approval on highly classified operations linked to Noche Eterna's drug and human trafficking network. Lucia's breath hitched. "Steve," she whispered. Steve's jaw clenched. "Tell me it's fake." Lucia looked away. Diaz laughed. "Ah, this is my favorite part," he said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "The moment the hero realizes he's been fighting for the wrong side." Steve felt his hands tremble. This whole time, the CIA, the government, the fentanyl lab, the mine, and now Lucia, she had been hiding something, from him, from everyone. Lucia lifted her head. "I can explain," she said, voice tight. Diaz smirked, sipping his drink. "Cece, please explain." Lucia's eyes locked onto Steve's. "This isn't what you think," she said. Steve fought the urge to yell. "What the hell is it then?" Lucia swallowed hard. Then she said something that made Steve's blood run cold. "I wasn't covering for them." She took a deep breath. "I was trying to stop something worse." Lucia's voice lowered. "This cartel?" she said. "It's not just another cartel." Steve stayed silent. Lucia's hands curled into fists. "It's being used for something bigger." She nodded toward the files. "The fentanyl? The human trafficking? It's not just about money, it's about control." She licked her lips. "They're moving people, high-value people, through the cartel's system." Steve frowned. "High value?" Lucia nodded. "Scientists, chemists, weapons engineers." She looked him in the eye. "This isn't just drugs, Steve. It's biological warfare." Diaz leaned forward. "See?" he said. "Now we are all on the same page." Steve's head pounded. Everything was twisting, changing. Lucia had lied, but if she was telling the truth now, then the real enemy wasn't just the cartel. It was whoever was pulling their strings. Lucia exhaled. "I wasn't protecting them," she said. "I was trying to figure out who was really in charge." She met his gaze. "And now we have a name." She pointed to the last page of the file. Steve's stomach dropped, because at the top of the chain, above the cartel, above the corrupt officials, above it all, was a single name. Alberto Ruiz, a Mexican billionaire, a pharmaceutical mogul, a man with direct ties to U.S. intelligence, cartel leaders, and global defense contractors, and the mastermind behind everything. Diaz chuckled. "I see you understand now," he said. He took another sip of whiskey. Then he slid a knife across the table. "Now we make a deal." Steve and Lucia stayed silent. "You want Ruiz?" Diaz said. "I want out." Lucia frowned. Diaz leaned forward. "The cartel is dying, but me?" He smirked. "I know things, and I know that Ruiz is the real power behind all of this." He tapped the knife. "I'll help you get to him," Steve glared. "And what do you want in return?" Diaz's grin widened. "I walk away, clean." Lucia exhaled sharply. "If we do this," she said, "we need everything you have on Ruiz." Diaz nodded. "Done." Steve's gut twisted. He had spent his whole life hunting men like Diaz. Now he had to work with him. He hated it, but he hated Ruiz more. And if this was the only way to bring him down, then so be it. Diaz stood up. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow, we go to war." He turned to leave. Then, he stopped at the door. "Oh," he added, glancing at Rex. "Make sure your dog is ready too. He's going to see a lot of blood." Steve felt his fingers twitch. Diaz left. Lucia sat back, exhaling. And Steve? He placed a hand on Rex's head. The dog leaned into him. Tomorrow, they were going after Ruiz. Tomorrow, this war would explode, and Steve would make sure every last monster paid in blood. What happens when you're forced to fight alongside the devil, to take down something even worse? Steve Johnson had fought cartels, corrupt cops, and a government that wanted him dead. But Alberto Ruiz? This was different. This was bigger than drugs, bigger than trafficking, bigger than anything he had ever faced. Ruiz wasn't just another cartel boss. He was the architect of the entire system. A billionaire pharmaceutical tycoon who had spent years crafting a supply chain that stretched across governments, industries, and criminal empires. The fentanyl wasn't just a product, it was a weapon, a biological attack disguised as an overdose crisis. And the US government wasn't stopping him. They were helping him. Ruiz had bought everyone except Steve, Lucia, and Rex. And now, they were going to burn it all to the ground. Cartel underboss Manuel Diaz sat across from them in a safe house outside Mexico City. Lucia's wound was stitched up, Steve's ribs still ached, Rex was bandaged but ready. And the plan? It was suicide. "We hit him at his mansion," Diaz said. "Big estate outside Cancun. He's got a private airstrip, his own security force, and an escape route if things go bad." Steve folded his arms. "Sounds airtight," Diaz smirked. "Nothing is airtight if you're crazy enough." He laid a map on the table. Ruiz is holding a meeting with his cartel partners and some of his government friends. It's his final move before going international. After this, he disappears, runs his empire from the shadows. Steve nodded. "So we make sure he never gets the chance." Lucia exhaled. "He'll have diplomatic protection. Even if we take him down, the US might cover for him." Steve's jaw tightened. "Then we don't give them the chance." The air was thick with humidity and death. Ruiz's estate was a fortress, surrounded by miles of jungle with high-tech surveillance, armed guards, and an underground panic room. Steve, Lucia, Rex, and Diaz moved in the shadows, cutting through the perimeter like ghosts. They weren't alone. Diaz had called in old cartel enforcers, men betrayed by Ruiz, men who wanted revenge. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about sending a message. This was war. A guard on the watchtower lit a cigarette. Steve pulled the trigger. Crack. The man dropped, dead before the smoke left his lips. Lucia moved in, silent, lethal. A quick knife to the throat, no alarms, no mercy. Then, the breach. They stormed the mansion. Bullets ripped through the night. Cartel enforcers screamed as shadows tore through their ranks. Steve moved like a predator, taking them down one by one. Rex was a demon unleashed, dragging gunmen to the floor, tearing through flesh. This wasn't a firefight. This was an execution. Ruiz was waiting for them, standing in his pristine white suit untouched by the chaos. Behind him, a private helicopter, blades spinning. His escape plan. Steve raised his gun. "You're not going anywhere." Ruiz smirked. "I have a passport. I have a plane. I have a government that will protect me." His eyes flickered to Lucia. "And I have people like her to keep me safe." Steve's finger tightened on the trigger. Lucia stepped forward. "No more deals. No more secrets. You die here." Ruiz laughed. "You think killing me stops this?" He stepped forward, fearless. "This system is bigger than me, bigger than you. You think America wants this to end?" His voice was calm, almost mocking. "The only difference between me and your politicians," he smiled, "I don't lie about it." Steve hesitated for half a second, and in that second Ruiz made his move. Ruiz lunged, drawing a concealed pistol. Lucia fired first. Bang! The bullet slammed into Ruiz's chest. He stumbled. Steve stepped forward. He didn't speak, didn't hesitate, didn't give Ruiz the chance to beg. Bang! One shot, right between the eyes. Ruiz collapsed. The man who had built an empire on suffering was nothing more than a corpse in the dirt. And Steve? He felt nothing. Because this war wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, the news was everywhere. Billionaire found dead in cartel raid. Mexican authorities blame US agents for unauthorized operation. CIA denies any involvement. The government was scrambling. The system was panicking. They couldn't hide the truth anymore. The world now knew about the cartel human trafficking pipeline. Knew about the fentanyl as a bioweapon. Knew that Ruiz had been backed by powerful figures in Washington and Mexico City in global pharmaceutical companies. And the real war had just begun. Steve, Lucia, and Rex vanished. The world thought they were dead. Some people called them terrorists. Some people called them heroes. But the truth never really mattered. Because the system was already rebuilding itself. New faces, new deals, new lies. The same cycle, starting all over again. And Steve wasn't going to let that happen. There's a rumor that in the shadows of the border, where the cartel still operates, where the government still profits, there's a ghost, a man with a Belgian Malinois at his side, a man who never forgot the people they left behind, a man who knows that justice isn't given, it's taken, one bullet at a time. The end. Or just the beginning. What happens when you take down the king, but the kingdom still stands? What happens when the war never really ends? What happens when a legend refuses to die? Somewhere out there, Steve is still watching, still waiting for the next monster to rise. And when they do, he'll be ready.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.